All right, welcome everybody. We are excited to have you, even if it is a little bit cold and depending upon where you're joining us from, maybe a little bit snowy. We know it's hopefully you've got everything taken care of outside and maybe getting a bite of lunch as you join us today. I'm Rosalind Biggs. I am with Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as a beef cattle extension specialist, and I also work for the College of Veterinary Medicine as the Director of Continuing Education. Dr. Lallman, would you like to introduce yourself?
So David Lallman, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist. I have a split appointment in research and extension. Welcome to you all once again. I have a good lineup here today. We're fortunate to get I think about somewhere between 6 and 7 tenths of rain here in the Stillwater area last night. So happy for that. Looking forward to your all's comments.
All right, just as a reminder, if you've got a question, we certainly welcome questions throughout the presentation. We may wait until the end of each of our presenters conclude with their slides before taking those, but feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A, or you can even raise your hand. We might move you over and let you ask those questions live if that works better for you too. But don't forget that Q&A and chat as you may have questions during the presentation. So with that, Dr. Goodman, I'll have you go ahead and bring your slides up, and we'll give a little bit of a brief bio and then let you take it from there. So Dr. Laura Goodman is joining us today, and we're excited to have her. She's an assistant professor, of course, here at Oklahoma State University in natural resource ecology and management, and one of our extension specialists for rangeland ecology. She received her PhD in range science from New Mexico State, as well as her master's from there too, and then received her bachelor's at Abilene Christian University. So Dr. Goodman, I know you have a long list of accolades, but we'll get to the presentation because I think that's why everybody's joined us today. So I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So today I'm just going to talk about different strategies for kind of minimizing those impacts from drought. I primarily work on native or rangeland pastures. So, I'm working in pastures that haven't been planted to an introduced forage. I will let Brian address any other questions that have to do with that management. But today I kind of just want to discuss some of the different things that I think might help people in preparing for drought. So we'll talk about different vegetation management strategies. We'll talk about grazing management, some options for diversifying your herd, and also just diversifying your forage resources within those pastures. We're pretty limited in what we can do with our native pastures, and rainfall really is the determining feature. And so we'll just discuss some of the options of ideas that you might find helpful for dealing with drought. So the first thing that I want to talk about is our vegetation management. When in Oklahoma, pretty much the whole state is dealing with woody plants coming into areas that were primarily prairies in the past. And so there is a new app called the Rangeland Analysis app. And it's just an online program where you can actually look at the cover of woody plants versus grasses across your pasture. And it will show what the tree cover is and actually give you an estimate of biomass production. And so, I like to call this the green drought because, quite frankly, when we have woody plants taking over our pastures, it can really reduce the amount of forage that we're growing in those areas. And it lasts much longer than most of our drought does. And so here, this visual showing a pasture on the left that has been maintained as a prairie with 14% tree cover, and the woodland pasture on the right that has been encroached by eastern red cedar and is now 61% woodland. And you can see the difference in the productivity. The annual biomass on the pasture that's being maintained as a prairie is at 3,300 pounds per acre versus this woodland pasture that has dropped down to just 1,000 pounds per acre in that pasture. And so when we look at how much that impacts our production over the course of time, we have pastures that can grow in central Oklahoma and eastern Oklahoma. We can grow, upwards of 4,000 pounds per acre. This pasture we sampled here was growing 4,700 pounds per acre with no cedar trees. And then in areas that had been encroached by cedar trees and had up to 80% cedar cover, the production had dropped down to only 1,300 pounds. And so you can see that this affects your stocking rate pretty drastically. With no cedar trees, that pasture could graze 10 cows on an 80-acre pasture year round, if they were about 1,000-pound cow, versus in an area that had that much cedar, you're down to 3 cows on an 80-acre pasture year round. So about with every 10% increase in cedar, we are losing about 400 pounds per acre of production. Another thing to think about, other than woody plant control, is the stocking rate that you're using long-term with the grazing management. As far as grazing management goes, stocking rate really is the most important decision to be made for sustainability and performance of that pasture during a drought. And so here we have some data that is from 25 different studies that looks at the effect of using different grazing intensities where we're removing different amounts of vegetation. And the thing that I kind of wanted to point out is that when we're grazing at a moderate or light way, where we're only moving 43 or 32% of that above ground biomass, we have much greater production in pounds per acre during our drought years. So we have, these are from pastures across the West, so the production is much lower than some of our pastures here in Oklahoma. But we tend to not lose all of the really great palatable plants that we have in a drought when we're grazing in a more sustainable way. Let's see if I can get this. So, a question that folks sometimes ask is then, well, how do I figure out what a sustainable stocking rate might be? There's a tool within the rangeland analysis platform that can actually help you with determining what the stocking rate would be for your pasture. This is specifically made for native pastures, so you wouldn't use this on an introduced pasture that you're fertilizing and managing with other ways. But if you have native pastures and you're trying to figure out what a stocking rate might be, you can go in here and use their forage production and stocking rate calculator to enter in a pasture that you're interested in looking at. It will calculate the acres that are within that pasture after you've delineated it in the tool. And then you enter the cattle size that you're interested in grazing and what you estimate their intake would be and how long they'll graze. And it will give you both the production of that pasture over the past number of years. And it will also give you the number of animals that it would estimate it could have carried during those different years. And so here's some data that I had it calculate for a property that is south of Clinton, Oklahoma, on one of our research stations. And so it was estimating that the average productivity in pounds per acre is 2,200 pounds. This is a mixed grass prairie area that has lots of buffalo grass and blue grama and some of our tall grass species, but much less than central and eastern Oklahoma would have. And their lowest estimate that it calculated was 844 pounds, with the highest at 3,000 pounds. And so you can see how that changed what the stocking rate would have been in each of those years if you were grazing 1,300 pound cows year round. So that's at the Rangeland Analysis Platform, or www.rangelands.app. So that's a really excellent tool. Another thing to consider, other than controlling woody plants and stocking rate, is what your cattle herd is made up of. And so this is data that's from a survey that was done a few years ago. And basically in Oklahoma, we have, a large proportion of folks that are grazing both cow-calf and stocker. We do have some folks that are still cow-calf only, and there's some opportunities there that can help with drought when we diversify our herd to a greater degree. This data is from actually New Mexico, where I came from, but there's been quite a bit of economic data looking at the average annual net returns of different types of stocking approaches. And so on the left, we have conservative stocking, where the ranch managers picked a stocking rate and picked a conservative one and then just stayed with that year after year after year. They compared cow-calf operations versus cow-calf plus stocker. And then on the right, they have a flexible stocking where the landowners actually adjusted, and in wet years stocked with more animals and in dry years stocked with less animals. And they found that the most profitable approach ended up being this cow-calf plus stockers. And the main reason that they found this was that with the cow-calf only, if you need to destock, you're selling animals when prices are low, and then you're buying animals when prices are high, and there's this lag time in getting a saleable product. And so if you're buying bred heifers or you're buying bred cows, you're going to pay more for those animals, but they are going to have calves earlier. And so you can get your numbers back up more quickly, but you have more invested. And so there's actually been some data where they looked at this, and there's, after a year of drought, sometimes it can impact livestock producers for up to 7 years versus never having a drought. And so trying to figure out flexible ways of adjusting that stocking rate by keeping a mature cow herd that you would be able to support even in a drought year, and then modifying the number of animals that you keep, either by retaining ownership of calves for longer, bringing in stockers, some of these other options, or even leasing some forage and grazing other cows if you're really set on cow-calf only. I know that there's a lot of folks in Nebraska that find that that's a really profitable way of modifying their stocking rate to meet when you have excess forage. And so here, of course, are the cash rental rates for pastures in Oklahoma. They updated our Oklahoma fact sheet for 2020, 2021. And so, thinking about maintaining that cow herd, but keeping it at a smaller number that that your ranch can support, and then supplementing that with either leasing or stockers is an option. So another question that often comes up with adjusting stocking rates is, well, how do I know what I'm even growing this year as far as my production? And there's a tool online called the GrassCast. It's hosted at the Drought Mitigation Center. So the University of Nebraska-Lincoln hosts the Drought Mitigation Center as well as the GrassCast tool. This tool uses observed weather data and forecasted weather data. They also use information about the plants. They're using remote sensed data from satellite imagery, and then ground truth data that was collected over 30 years, where they look at this relationship between rainfall, when it's occurring, how much we're getting, and how much forage growth we should be getting at that in response to that rainfall. And so they have an idea of these relationships, and so they can predict how much we will likely grow in a given year. So this is what the GrassCast looks like. Unfortunately, it's not available for the east side of the state at this point in time. But for those that live on the west side of the state, it will generate 3 different maps showing what you will likely grow relative to what you normally do. So it'll give a percent. You might be 5 to 15% above normal, or 5 to 15% below normal, or 30% above normal, or 30% below normal. And so your stocking rate would actually fluctuate to the same degree. So you would stock 30% heavier if you were growing 30% more vegetation. And so these are maps that you can look at. Ideally, you would use these during the growing season. About 90% of our vegetation, our forage, grows from April to August. And by the first week in August, we've received what we're going to grow in that year, because we're just primarily warm season plants. So you can look at this. It will zoom into a 6 mile by 6 mile grid, so you can find your location on the map. It's updated every 2 weeks, and it shows that percent change in production. It's really ideal to use this, in July, midsummer, versus trying to do it, in April, where they just have kind of no idea what we're going to be getting as far as rainfall. This is the map that was generated last year, September 1, 2021. And so the orange to red is areas that are dry, and the bluer areas are areas that actually receive more moisture and should have grown normal or above normal amounts. And then last, I just want to talk about diversifying the forage resources we have available. The best way that I know how to do this within a pasture is with patch burn grazing. In patch burn grazing, we burn just a portion of a pasture, but we allow animals access to the entire pasture. And what happens is they concentrate their grazing on that regrowth following the burn, and they ignore those other areas. And so you can stockpile forage in those unburned areas while they're concentrating their grazing on the burned patch. And as you burn the next patch and the next patch, they move around the pasture on their own. But it allows you to stockpile, and that is really one of the best tools that we have to mitigate the effects of drought, is stockpiling forage for multiple years. And so this is an excellent way to do that. There's been some research in Kansas where they compared annually burned patches versus patch burn pastures, and they looked at this. They had data for 9 years, but in 2011 and 2012, of course, we had drought, and they didn't lose productivity in those patch burn pastures because of the drought, unlike in the annually burned pastures, where there was a 26-pound difference in gain over the season on these stockers between the patch burn pastures versus the annual pastures. And so we're providing that high quality feed in the burn patch, tons of quantity in the unburned patches, and we're stockpiling forage as well. For Oklahoma data, this is showing stocker weight gains over a 10-year period where they compared no burning with the orange line versus patch burn grazing. And there was a pretty drastic difference as time went on in the gains that we were getting in these patch burn pastures versus the unburned pastures. And so this is just an excellent approach to stockpiling and providing really high quality feed. If I have time to share this little video, I will do that just to show what this would look like. Okay, so to wrap up, the things to think about when we're preparing for drought are controlling those encroaching trees and shrubs that may be preventing many of your excellent forage grasses from growing in your native pasture. Another thing to think about is using sustainable stocking rates and also trying to be flexible with those stocking rates to meet what you have growing. And so hopefully you can check out some of those tools like the rangeland analysis platform or the GrassCast to help you figure out what that might be for your specific property. Thinking about ideas about diversifying your herd and maybe some different options for you to be able to have some flexible stocking with the types of animals that you're grazing. And then lastly, just thinking of ways to diversify your forage resources and different approaches for stockpiling forage in the event that we do end up in a drought. Hopefully there's something in there that might be useful to you. And with that, I will share my contact info. If you're interested in emailing me any questions, feel free to. And then these are our social media platforms if you're interested in following us there. And of course, the extension webpage where we have many fact sheets available.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. We got lots of good information there. I was myself pretty excited for our agenda today, having some property in more of the western side of the states, as well as for our operation in here around Stillwater. So I get the best of both worlds today. I think we'll save questions for you. I know I've got a couple directly. I will point out, I did put those direct links for that Rangelands app, as well as the GrassCast in the chat, if you're at a computer where you want to copy those and then maybe mark them as favorites or use them later. So Dr. Goodman, again, great information. I think we'll turn it over to Brian, and then we'll tackle questions at the end, if that's all right by you.
Great, thank you.
All right, Brian, you should be all set to bring your presentation up. So many know, and we've heard from Brian before, Brian's our Northeast area agronomy specialist, and we're excited again to have him as well as Dr. Goodman join us. Brian earned his bachelor's in animal science with minors in agronomy and ag systems technology management, and also holds a master's in crop, soil, and environmental science. So with that, Brian, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and we're going to talk about introduced forages.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Biggs. Yeah, excited again to get to be with all of y'all and talk a little bit about some of the things that we might be able to do when it comes to managing our introduced forages. Not as excited about the potential of being in drought conditions again. I guess I've lived through two of these in my professional career in 04 and 05, and then 11, 12, and 13. And they're never easy to get through, but hopefully some of these strategies here that we're going to talk about would sure help you make some decisions that might alleviate some of that pain that we've seen in the past. One of the major things that, I really look at now is it's really not just a drought that we're facing. Again, those are always tough to get through, but they're made a whole lot tougher when we have these high input costs. And we're seeing that all across the board right now. Most of our inputs have went up drastically. Some of those have increased drastically just in the last 3 to 6 months. And that really makes some of these strategies that normally could get us out of some drought issues without having to liquidate a large portion of our herd, such as maybe supplemental feeding of cows to get them through those dry periods. That makes it a little tougher to stomach because of the cash outlay that we'd have to be seeing. So again, fertilizer has went through the roof. We saw it come back down here a few weeks ago, and then I hear that it could be going back up again. So you're very volatile in the fertilizer market right now. Supplement costs are, of course, higher than what they've been in quite a while. Hay started out fairly moderate back in the fall, and then I think most producers realized we had one of the driest Septembers on record. Very short production from our introduced pastures in the fall, and hay become a scarce resource. So we've seen prices of hay go up drastically. And then you've probably been hearing about herbicide costs are going up as well. So really, when I look at all four of these as an agronomist and as a livestock producer, what I see is, from an ag econ perspective, what we put in that feed cost category. It's all the things that go into a cow's mouth through the year to meet her nutritional requirements. And all of these are going up. So that's something we have to consider. One thing I like to point out is that as costs rise, as these inputs continue to increase, the value of our forage is also increasing. So if hay jumps from $35 a bale to $70 a bale on the open hay market, the value of our standing forage in our pastures also increases in value. So again, we need to keep that in mind, and that means we need to conserve it. We need to manage it to the best of our ability. How do we do that? Probably the first way is just sit down and develop a plan. We're going to start with baseline assessments. We'll talk briefly about those as we go through today. Optimize our production within system constraints. And what that means is I'm not necessarily trying to maximize my production, but I'm going to look at what is my budget? How much money do I have available to spend? What's my soil type? What's my forage base or the species that I have? And I'm going to try to optimize the production based on all of those constraints. And again, balanced forage systems, we'll talk briefly about this today too, but this is probably the best way to beat a drought, is to have both warm and cool season forages that you specifically manage for your cow herd. Capitalize on available moisture. Again, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how we can maybe do that better. Scrutinize expenditures based on potential savings or revenue. And again, this is a hard one, and sometimes we have to see into the future a little bit. There are times we have to spend $1 to maybe make $2 in the end. And I'll hear people say, well, I'd rather just not spend any money and not take that risk. But oftentimes in a drought, by not doing anything, we run the risk of losing $2. So that dollar invested to make $2 additional could really be a good investment. Exploit efficiency factors. We're going to hit on that a little bit today. How can we be more efficient in the way that we grow the forage and also in the way that we harvest that forage with the cow? And be aware of drought-induced livestock losses. I'm not going to talk about this today other than just to mention, we always hear these stories when we get cow herds into drought situations. Be careful of nitrates, prussic acid, toxicity on that sorghum family of plants. Watch out for poisonous plants. As forage is in short supply, cows will sometimes start consuming poisonous plants as well. And then also water quality issues could be a concern. So blue-green algae and things like that might be something we need to consider during droughty conditions. Okay, so I guess my first one here is we start putting that baseline assessment together. The question is, do you have your soil test? Now is a great time for all of our warm season forages to be getting a soil test. They're in a dormant state. We're not seeing active uptake of nutrients from the soil. So right now in February and March, if you've got Bermuda, if you've got Old World Blue Stem, this is a great time to be sampling. And again, we do have probes that we check out at most county extension offices. We'd like to see you randomly walk a zigzag across each pasture or paddock field that you have and take 15 to 20 cores at least. And here's the really important part, to a 6-inch depth. We don't need it at 4 inches. We don't need it at 8. That's going to skew the results. Take it to a 6-inch depth, and your county extension educator and possibly some of your specialists would be able to help you work up a plan so you know what fertility might need to be applied on your property. And again, I know input costs are high, but this is probably the best $10 that you could spend going into 2022 is to take a soil test and know what that baseline is on your property. The next baseline strategy that I always promote, and if you've ever heard me speak before, you've got about 97.5% odds that you've probably heard me mention forage budget. Very important to me to know how much you're producing and how much your cow herd needs. Without that knowledge, there's very little we can actually do to pre-plan when it comes to a forage standpoint. There's also very little we can do to pre-plan from an economic standpoint. So again, the OSU fact sheet, Plant and Soil Science 2584, will walk you through the basics of how to do a forage budget. It is math, but it's very simple math. It's very easy to understand. And I think once you start using it, you'll be very impressed with the power that it gives you for making decisions. Two very simple questions are answered once you get through the forage budget. How much forage does the cows need? And how much are we producing? And I'm going to show you a real quick example here of how this works. We need to hit a few rules of thumb first. We do know from many OSU research trials that on average, on our introduced forages in eastern Oklahoma, we're going to make about 1 ton of forage production per acre if we're not fertilizing. That's a good average rule of thumb. And we can get more accurate than that. Dr. Goodman showed you some really neat tools for assessing rangeland productivity. We can use Web Soil Survey to also show us the productivity of our introduced forages and get a more specific projection of how much potential forage we can make on our property based on soil type. But again, if we don't have that, we can just assume 1 acre is going to make 1 ton per year. We also know that our warm season forages such as Bermuda grass or Old World bluestem, crabgrass, hay grazer, those are all going to require about 50 pounds of actual N to produce 1 additional ton of forage. Our cool season forages like fescue, if you're in northeast Oklahoma, or our small grains such as wheat, rye, triticale, oats, those require about 60 pounds of nitrogen to make 1 additional ton of forage. So basically just show you real quick how the forage budget works. You basically identify the cattle type that you have. We're going to use a 1,200 pound cow here today. We know on average that cow is going to eat about 2.5% of her body weight through the year, but we can't get every blade of grass that we grow into a cow's belly. So we have to factor in a utilization factor, okay? And again, it's hard to get above about 70% utilization. That would be a very in-depth, intensive rotational grazing system. As Dr. Goodman pointed out, if you're continuous grazing, we're probably around 30%. So if we look at 30 pounds needed in the cow's rumen divided by 0.65 or 0.7 for 70%, we end up with 43 pounds per day we need to put in front of her face to get 30 pounds in her rumen. Simple enough to understand. Total number of days we want to run these cows for 7 months. This is a Bermuda grass pasture. We're going to run them all the way through the summer on it. That means that each cow needs about 9,000 pounds of forage. And that equates to about 7.8 tons, almost 8 tons per cow per year. Now let's stop and think about that for a minute. So again, if I've got 150 acres and I'm making 1 ton per acre, how many acres does it take to run that cow? Well, if all of the forage for her yearly requirement, 365 days, is coming off our property, both grazed forage and hay, we need about 8 acres per cow if we're not fertilizing introduced forage. And I think that's how it's so easy to slip into an overstock scenario, and then we run into many more problems. So again, this herd here is 100 cows. Total forage required is 452 tons just to make it through 210 days of the grazing season. We've already established we're only growing about 150 tons for the entire property. So we're only offering those cows about 1/3 of what they need through that 7-month period. And again, it's very easy to see why we get into situations where cows are in very thin shape. They don't regain body condition through the summer, and they start the winter out in very poor body condition. So really this stocking intensity, carrying capacity of the land is super important, and the forage budget is the first step to help you figure out where you need to be as far as the number of animals out there. Shifting gears a little bit. Again, maybe if you're planning on baling hay off your own property, you're not bringing hay in from down the road. You know, a lot of times we all believe, hey, Bermuda grass is the king of all forages, and it is a really useful forage but it is not the king. And one of the reasons that I don't like it is that we rely on about 5 or 5.5 months of production to supply the cow herd for the total year. We're baling hay, we're grazing cows. The question is, what happens if we don't get summer rains? What happens if we are in a summer drought? And basically what we see is that no longer do we not have grazing for the cows in the summer, but we're also not making that hay that is needed to get that cow herd through the winter and back to next spring when Bermuda starts growing again. So this is another reason to really start thinking about how can I balance my forage system and grow both warm and cool season forages. And I'll give you one more point here on this slide, why that would be very important. And it comes down to the ability to capture rainfall as it falls from the sky and immediately convert that moisture into forage. So again, if you notice, this is for Payne County. This is an average rainfall graph that you see there. It doesn't matter what county you're in the body of Oklahoma, we do see a bimodal rainfall pattern. So we're going to get peaks around April and May, and we're also going to see peak rainfall somewhere in that September timeframe. Now, magnitude of that rainfall may be different. One of the biggest threats that we have for drought happens to occur right in the middle of the summer there, right during prime Bermuda grass or Old World blue stem growing conditions. So again, that's why we do tend to get into issues when we're solely relying on these warm season forages. As you notice on this graph, if we look over here in February, that is a prime time, not only to fertilize our cool season forages that are starting to grow in the spring, but also to capture that increasing amount of rain that's falling about this time of year and forward. And then also the same thing in the fall. We do get really good September rains that we should be using for forage production. So again, warm season forage systems tend to capitalize on only spring and summer rainfall. Balanced forage systems capture annual rainfall and put it to use. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the options we have now. I tend to always get a lot of questions when we see drought. We see that hay is short. About January and early February, lots of calls are coming into county offices about what can I plant in the spring that will help me out. I'm short of hay. I'm having to ration back on the cows. And this is hopefully going to give you a little information that might help you through. This is a trial that we actually put in up in Nowata County back in 2013. So that was a year following the drought. We went in and seeded ryegrass, wheat, and oats. And we had a couple different rates. We had different nitrogen application rates as well. We were a little later than what we wanted to be that year because the soil was so cold. So again, that's one thing that might hang us up a little bit. We were about 30 days later than what we'd normally like to get in there. But as you can see, we did really well with the oats. We were able to make 4,000 to 5,000 pounds of production per acre with the oats. The wheat looks okay on this graph, but I will warn you, if you're spring seeding wheat and we don't get enough cold temperatures to vernalize that wheat seed, you'll see very, very poor production with spring seeded wheat. And I also tend to have the same opinion about spring seeded ryegrass. It's a hit or miss proposition whether it works or not. So again, oats are a really good option for you if you maybe want to go in now in the next week or so and try to get some seed in the ground and help produce some more cool season forage to help you through the winter. There's a caveat to that though. And really the biggest caveat to what we've seen in all these spring seeded trials is that if you're really wanting to reduce your winter feeding period now for this winter, we're a little too late with a spring seeded forage option. Most of what you saw on that previous slide, most of that production actually occurred after the first week of May. So again, if I am really trying to shorten up my winter feeding period on my cow herd, it's too little too late. If I'm worried about maybe refilling lost hay supplies, a hay barn, a hay patch, then it is a great option for putting up some decent quality hay, fairly good tonnage early in the season, and again, maybe not impacting our warm season forages that we're going to be starting to utilize here in that May time period. So it's a great last minute hay crop, but we shouldn't rely solely on it to reduce the amount of winter hay and feed that we need at this point in time. Okay, so I'm kind of trying to go chronologically through. That was right now. What can we do here in about 2 or 3 months as we start to see good green up, hopefully, on our summer forages? What can we do there to help with production? And I always get asked the question, should we really be thinking about fertility in a drought? And hopefully this will help answer that question. We've had a lot of trials that show absolutely maybe the one time to be the most serious about fertilizing introduced forages is during a drought. So again, if you look at this, it didn't matter if we applied, this was 100 pounds of actual N applied the first week of May. And we saw the untreated check, the control made about 750 pounds of total forage production for the entire year. I want to remind you, 2005 was again a very serious drought year. Where we put down that 100 pounds of N, we did see, again, as we expected, almost 2 additional tons of production. So again, 7.4 inches of rain is not much all the way from May until October, but we made really good production by putting the nutrients down. If we look at this June application in lower left, that was the middle week of June, almost the same amount of rainfall from that point until the end of October, and we saw almost the same amount of production. So what you should be seeing there is that Bermuda grass and crabgrass, teff, hay grazer, they're all very receptive to nitrogen, and they can put a lot of yield on in a short amount of time if the nutrients are there in that root zone. This lower right graph is a last week of August application. And again, that would be a perfect example of why stockpiling works so well. Now, we didn't make as much production, but we also didn't have as much rainfall, and we're starting to see shortening day lengths as well. But again, I think that helps show that really anytime through the summer, we can fertilize warm season grasses if we think we're going to get some rain on it. This was in 2012, again, an extremely droughty year. This was at the Eastern Research Station at Haskell on my Midland 99 Bermuda grass stand. We were doing a trial comparing poultry litter and commercial fertilizer at nutrient equivalent rates. We were actually drier at Haskell than what Woodward was at the Mesonet station in that year. So we were extremely dry. This was the untreated area that you're seeing here. You can see a little bit of Bermuda. There's some foxtail in there, a lot of bare ground. We've got some broadleaf forbs, that's spurge that's coming up in there. Total production, 1,290 pounds per acre for the entire year. About a third of that was actually Bermuda. So we only made about 400 pounds of actual Bermuda grass on that site. This was right next to it. This was one of our treatments that was 2 tons of poultry litter. We saw the exact same thing if we used commercial fertilizer at the same level of nutrient input. We made 3,700 pounds of production, and it was essentially 90% plus Bermuda grass. So again, does that look perfect? Is that the kind of yield we would expect in an average year? No, but we did make more yield just from fertilizing. The biggest key, though, for me, when I went back and looked at these trials in 2013 and 2014, is that every one of these untreated control plots, we essentially lost that stand to Midland 99. Everywhere that we put any fertility down during the drought, we saved that stand. So again, that's something to think about. Health of that forage stand is very important. We did all of that with just less than 3 inches of rainfall all the way from the 1st of May until essentially frost. So what I want to tell you there is that fertility, nutrients, makes a plant more water use efficient. There's an old study that was done back in the 50s that showed if you're not fertilizing Bermuda, it takes 20 inches of rain to make a ton of production. If you are fertilizing moderately, it takes 4 inches of rain to make a ton of production. A good way to look at it is, again, fertility makes a plant more water use efficient. This was the data off of that Midland 99 study. And as you can see, as we increased our nitrogen rate, we saw that basically the amount of moisture required to produce 1 ton of forage decreased. So again, we're getting more water use efficient as we start to increase those nutrients there in the root zone. Okay, Brian, you're telling me to go out and fertilize, but fertilizer is super expensive right now. How in the world can we afford to do it? I'm just going to show you a real quick little graph here I think will help sell that point. Assuming that we're just using nitrogen, we're going to grow the forage and let the cow harvest it. And we're going to assume 65% utilization, 35% waste. And then we're also going to buy hay. We're going to buy hay from the neighbor. We're going to feed it in an open bottom steel ring. As Dr. Lawman's research shows, you should be somewhere around 20% loss in an open bottom steel ring. So 80% utilization. If we assume that cow needs to consume 30 pounds of forage, and if I'm willing to pay $35 for an 1,100 pound bale of hay, that's going to cost me about $1.19 per cow per day. I can go out and pay up to $945 per ton of urea, apply 110 pounds of urea per acre, which is 50 pounds of actual N. That should produce 1 additional ton of production per acre. And that would give me about 45 grazing days at roughly a $50 investment. So again, it's about $1.18 per cow per day. So I understand that fertilizer costs look high, but sit down with a sharp pencil and a piece of paper and determine how many grazing days will I get from it. If we're at $700 on urea, it's definitely cheaper to do that than go out and buy $40, $45 per bale hay. This is a graph that shows that, and don't get too sidetracked by all the bars. But again, if we look at this green bar in this $950 column, and you follow it to the top of the green, and then you progress over to the right, you see that's about a $35 per bale value. If I'm down here at $500 a ton on urea, and I hear producers all the time say it's hard to pay for it at $500 a ton, that's equivalent to about a $17 1,100 pound bale of hay. And the question is here, is that hay going to be as good of quality as if we went out there and fertilized it and grew the forage? So again, I know the prices are high, but possibly if we can get in somewhere around that $700 to $800 per ton, it's still feasible to make the cow do the work. And we haven't even included the labor needed to haul that hay out to those cows. Dr. Goodman kind of addressed this a little bit. I'll hit it as well on the introduce side, but try to do something to improve forage utilization. You've already grown that forage. Now we just need to conserve it and use it wisely. So again, if you've been in a continuous stocking scenario, you're probably seeing 30 to 40% utilization of your forage. Now might be the time to consider going to a 4-paddock rotation system. By doing that, we can typically bump our utilization rates up to 55, 60, maybe even 65% utilization of that forage. And that's huge. Not only a lot of people will say that can increase stocking rates. Well, there's a lot of studies that show that is true. Here's a few right here that show we can increase stocking rates anywhere from 30 to 60% just by going from a continuous to a simple rotational stocking system. What I might mention, though, is that oftentimes if we feel like we're slightly overstocked based on the forage budget, or if we feel like forage supplies will be short due to drought, maybe we shouldn't look at it in the terms of how much increased stocking rate can I see, but we should look at it in how many increased grazing days can I get with my cow herd. So I'm going to leave my stocking rate, my stocking intensity exactly the same. I just know I'm going to be able to run those cows longer through the season. So again, consider that when it comes to forage utilization. I'll come back to that. I'll show you a couple pictures on that here in just a second, but I do want to get briefly into stockpiling. Dr. Goodman mentioned this, and this is probably my favorite topic in the world, is stockpiling different forages. Again, I've been very successful with this on my own operation. Have helped literally hundreds of producers set up their own stockpiling systems, and simply they work. Dr. Lawman did a lot of this research back 20 years ago, and it still works now like it did then. Couple of examples here. This was a herd at Valiant at our research station there, almost 250 head of cows. We stockpile a ½ acre per cow of Bermuda grass, really good quality forage here, actually even meeting the lactating cows requirements. We got about 38 grazing days at a ½ acre per cow. Again, the cost of that was 38 cents per cow per day. So if we compare that back to what I showed you those hay costs were in the beginning of $1.20 per cow per day, significant savings to make the cow do her own work. over that 38-day period on that whole herd, we only lost 9 pounds average. So that's a win in my book. Again, this is data over here on the right from Perkins. We had both a continuous grazed Bermuda paddock and a 3 to 5 day strip grazed Bermuda paddock. As you can see, really good quality. We picked up about 57 days at 1 cow per acre, stocking rate roughly. And essentially we were able to add 2 pounds average to those cows over that 57-day period. So no change in weight, no change in body condition score. We fed no hay and no supplement on any of those trials that you see right there. So again, that's a huge win, a huge savings to your pocketbook. Just a couple examples. Both of these pictures were taken at Perkins. This is our stockpile Bermuda field. We call that the Sonic trap because it's right there by Sonic. And you can see we're getting pretty good utilization by moving that fence every 3 to 5 days. Doesn't take long, it takes maybe 20 minutes to move that fence. This was our small grain pasture. And again, this is another reason that I want to promote. Plant a cool season forage in the fall. If you're in the fescue belt, try to utilize fescue as a cool season forage in the fall. Have some form of a cool season forage that can help you extend that grazing season. Getting on down here to the end with weed control. Again, one of the things to think about, we don't always need to spray herbicides. I always try to tell producers, let's go out, let's assess, do we have enough weeds there to justify an application? Usually that's going to be somewhere around 30%. Proper timing is going to save you money. So typically if we get on those weeds when they're very small, 2 to 4 inches tall, we can use a very economical herbicide option and save quite a bit of money over the long term. So think about that. Timing is important. When the rain does fall, what will take that moisture up? If you've got an 80% stand of a broadleaf weed that's unpalatable to cattle, again, and we start getting rain, those weeds, those forbs tend to be able to respond to that rainfall quicker than a forage stand that's been overgrazed for the last 3 months because we were in drought conditions. So keep that in mind as well. Work with your county educator. We can help you with a weed control strategy. Real quick, I want to show you on thresholds at that 20%. That's always kind of been 25 to 30% threshold is where most literature shows we need to start spraying in pasture. And again, if we look up here at a 20% weed infestation on a 1 ton per acre productivity site, we're only losing about 0.2 tons of forage on a per acre basis. So again, if we're able to buy forage at $60 per ton, we're only losing about $12 worth of forage. The question is, can I go out and spray that weed and control it for $12 or less? And it becomes a little iffy in that area. One of the problems, though, I think it's time we start rethinking pasture weed thresholds, much like we do in crops. And we base it on site productivity and weed threshold pressure. So again, if we look the same example, 20% weed infestation, but maybe we're on a 5 ton per acre Bermuda grass site, it's easy to see we're now losing 1 ton of usable forage. That would be worth that. Again, $60 per ton. It's probably going to cost you more than that right now. So the question is, can I spray a herbicide to control that weed for less than $60 an acre? Absolutely. And what we see is that even with fairly high herbicide application costs per acre, if we're on a good high productivity soil, it is a no-brainer to go ahead and use that herbicide. A couple pictures here to maybe help send that home. This was back in 2012. This was in Okfuskee County. This was a western ragweed stand, really bad area. The producer had about 200 acres, ran just a few cows on that property because very little grass underneath the western ragweed. We went in and put a herbicide trial in early in the year, and of course it's drought all the way through the summer. This is July 30th. Middle of August, we started getting a little rain. On September 4th, you can see what this looked like where we sprayed. We're already getting Bermuda response. The producer, bless his heart, he had brush hogged that twice through the summer, and you can see what's coming back after the rain out here, a good western ragweed stand. This was on September 14th, 105 days after treatment. Only about 30 days after the rain started falling, we were able to get almost 5 inches of rain there in that August and early September time period, even in the drought year of 2012. And as you can see, we made about 3,500 pounds of Bermuda grass production per acre in that 30 days. Where we had not sprayed, we made almost 4,000 pounds of Western ragweed and about 263 pounds of Bermuda. So again, hundreds of research trials show that for every pound of weeds we kill in a young state, we'll get about a pound of forage in return. That showed to be true in this as well. Last thing I'll leave you with here, think about leaves as a solar panel. We have to leave at least one, if not 2 leaves on the plant if we expect it to be able to regrow quickly. If we don't do that and we repeatedly overgraze that plant, we're robbing that root system of stored carbohydrates, stored energy, and eventually we're going to see the health of our forage stand decline very rapidly. For most of our forages like Bermuda and Old World Blue Stem, that's 2 to 3 inches. For our small grains and fescue, that's about 4 inches. So again, keep that in mind. Last thing I'll leave you with, and I don't want to overlap Dr. Goodman. I know she was talking about native and rangeland, but I'm a huge proponent of having some native forages. I still believe it's important to have at least 10% of your acreage in native forage just because of how drought tolerant those native forages are. So in summary, take that baseline data, soil test, and a forage budget, help you start that plan. Don't overstock. Look at that forage budget and make a good assessment of where you need to be as far as carrying capacity. Don't eliminate, but minimize inputs. Optimize your yields with whatever forage you have with smart fertility, and then improve the utilization of that forage. Again, most producers who have balanced forage systems were impacted very little during the droughts of 04 and 05 and 11 through 13. Stockpile something. Again, Bermuda grass, Old World Blue Stem. Maybe it's native that you stockpile and allow it to stand there. Stockpile something for use by that cow herd in the winter. And then again, if drought and high input costs are kind of hitting us together, it's time to rely on that forage base, and hopefully some of these tips will help you do that. One last little plug, Dr. Biggs, I told you I would do this, but if any of y'all are interested in more information about strategies to mitigate some of the rising input costs, every county in Northeast Oklahoma will be offering a 2-night series on how we can combat some of these rising input costs. It will be directed towards ag economics, agronomy, animal health, and livestock topics. Really good information. I think it'll be something great for you to attend. And again, each county in Northeast Oklahoma will be conducting these in the month of March 15th through April 30th. So again, stay tuned for those if that interests you. And with that, that's the end of mine. I appreciate the time.
All right, Brian, if folks are interested in the Ag Sense 2022, they just need to contact their county educator, I take it?
Yes.
Yep. So always a great resource for our county educators. Those of us at the state level are happy to help you, but the county educators are right there at your back door, so to speak. And I know they do a great job. Can't emphasize their importance enough. Now, Dr. Goodman, you had another program that we might want to mention too, right?
Yeah, so we were doing some research with virtual fence collars, and so we're looking for livestock producers that would be willing to allow us to use those virtual fence collars on their animals. We'd like to get input from them as far as how effective they think they are, and what they if there's issues with them, what they see those that might be. So we are specifically looking right now for folks that are kind of around Stillwater, near Stillwater. But we will be starting some research that's going to be more broad across the state. But currently, that's what we're looking for.
All right, fantastic. So I'll go ahead and put your email, if that's all right. Is that the easiest way to?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Laura Goodman at okstate.edu. You can shoot an email there. I'm going to put that in the chat here for us if you're interested in the research ongoing for the virtual fencing.
So Dr. Biggs, okay, if I get our questions started, I see you've got
Yes,
one
sir.
in the chat there. Dr. Goodman, if you were to, I don't know, consult for a local producer that's wanting to get started with the patch burning program, how would you suggest, what time of year, how much of their property and so on would you suggest?
Yeah, so if you already have a pasture where you're having some issues with distribution, there's, when that happens, a lot of times there's going to be excess forage from previous years, and it can get pretty coarse and animals don't really want to eat it. So sometimes those are the best spots to start patch burn grazing. You have a lot of fuel, and then you can also drive animal use to that part of the pasture. There's no rules as far as how many patches you do. So ideally, you use as many natural fire breaks as possible. So if we have ranch roads, they make excellent fire breaks that we can brush hog along those roads and widen that fire break out a little bit more. Creeks are also excellent for fire breaks. And so we can help you kind of identify areas that would be easy to turn into a burn patch. So basically the gist of it is we burn a patch, allow animals access immediately, and then you do have to follow up with another burn to move them around to another patch, because you don't want them to just stay on that burn patch forever. We want to move them to the next one. But we can help with writing burn plans and get them connected with prescribed burn associations. We have those across the state that can help with getting burns done. They do need to be stocked appropriately to make it work. So that's one thing we can also help with is getting that stocking rate sorted out.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I did go ahead again. I put Dr. Goodman's email address in the chat, and I also put our OSU Extension online course catalog, which does have a prescribed burning course if you're interested in taking a look at that a little closer, and then reaching out to your county extension educator as well. Obviously, lots of things available in that online course catalog, but for this discussion, and Dr. Lallman, you took my question as well for Dr. Goodman. I've got one for you, Brian, if that's all right. Obviously, we talked about that soil test being the best $10 we may spend this year. What kind of variability do we typically see in those soil tests related to, since we're operating at this point under drought conditions, how is that impacting our soil tests from year to year?
Yeah, we definitely do see some changes. One of the biggest things that we would see change in would be pH. pH probably changes more due to damp or dry soils than anything else. Most of our analysis of phosphorus, potassium, again, that's very important for the health of that plant. Those nutrients are still there on those soil colloids, even in droughty conditions. And when we put that extractant on it in the lab, we're still pulling that off. So we're going to see very similar results on P and K. And again, that's something important for us to look at. And we'll have a lot more information on that in that program I'm talking about, more detailed information about soil fertility and liming and things like that. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. I think that sounds like the great programming to take a closer look. I think this one was probably directed at you, Brian, so because we're talking about Bermuda, of course, but the question is, how do legumes in Bermuda affect yield, fertilizer need, and hay, haying days or hay availability?
Great question. One that we get a lot. Again, that's another topic we're covering in that series. Probably one of the biggest misnomers is that if you plant a legume, immediately there's 200 pounds of free nitrogen that the legumes are handing to the grass plants beside them. And it just really doesn't work like that. What we do see from long-term research is that a good legume stand intermixed in with grasses is going to produce somewhere between 1 to 2 additional tons per acre. So that really is free production. That would be equivalent to 50 to 100 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. So there's a lot of value in that. And again, my predecessor, Bob Woods at Haskell at the research station, ran over a decade of trials with legumes, and he saw pretty consistently 2 additional tons, regardless of what species of legume he had in there. So was that every part of that question?
Yes, sir. I think you got that one covered. Dr. Lallman, did we get all of them so far?
Well, I've got one more for Brian, then we're probably need to shut it down here because we're a little bit over time. But for those that can hang on, that we've heard a lot of questions this year, particularly about the legumes. Once again, how would you just briefly recommend a producer get started? Should you consider a mix of early season clover, midsummer clover, and so on?
Okay, that's a good question. And unfortunately, the time that we're at,
yeah,
the time that we're at in the year is actually probably not real conducive to having successful cool season legume stands. So farther north in Missouri, frost seeding the legumes is very common in the spring. It works really well. It's a little bit risky in this part of the world, though, because of our summer droughts, our dry weather. Those plants would not have a secondary root system developed, and they would essentially die as we got into hot, dry weather. So I don't like spring seeding on cool season species such as white clover, red clover, some of those. I think, Dr. Lohman, what I would tell them is now would be a good time to start with a warm season, possibly an annual species such as Korean Lespedeza or annual Lespedeza. Both of those are fairly easy to establish. They're high quality late in the summer. And that would get us going through this part of the summer, I guess, before we got to fall. And then we could start establishing some cool season varieties then.
Okay.
So again, I would steer clear of the cool season seeded varieties. And we did that same trial in Nowata. We've done that at Haskell, and we had complete stand failures every time we tried to spring seed those. So little trickier.
Okay.
I rambled too much on that, but I hope that answered your question.
Oh, that's helpful. A lot of folks have got that question. So, well, great turnout today, Dr. Biggs, and tremendous material. I know these videos or recordings are going to get utilized a lot. Thank you both for contributing to our Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
Great information. We'll direct our attendees back to the chat if you're looking for some of those resources that both speakers highlighted today in the presentations, and then remind you next week we will wrap up this extended drought series of webinars with taking a look at the weather. I know everybody's watching that close right now. At least we were at my house today as we put kids on the school bus. So. But next week we will have Wesley and Dr. Darrell Pugh join us talking about weather and the outlook of the cattle market and whether we should be considering destocking. So we've got a lot of ground yet to cover next week. So we hope you'll join us. And then again, as Dr. Lohman mentioned too, these are always recorded. We encourage you to take a look at beef.okstate.edu. That has the various recordings that have been part of this Rancher series from the very beginning, and allows you to take a look there if you're looking to make some changes or needing some more information. So with that, Dr. Lohman, have I missed anything?
No, ma'am. Good job. Thank you, Dr. Biggs.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Stay warm. Weather will be different tomorrow. So, and I guess we'll talk about it next week as well.